What happens when thousands of young Indians take to the streets demanding answers from their government? What happens when those protesters try to march toward Parliament and police respond with barricades, tear gas, and batons? And perhaps the biggest question of all, is this simply a law and order operation, or is India witnessing a dangerous restriction of democratic dissent? In July 2026, a movement that began online as satire has exploded into one of the biggest youth-led challenges Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has faced since 2014. It is called the Cockroach Janta Party, or CJP, and today we are going beyond the memes to examine what is actually happening in India. The story begins with something much more serious than a joke. India's young people have been increasingly frustrated over examination irregularities, alleged paper leaks, unemployment, and concerns about transparency in public institutions. The CJP movement emerged from this frustration. What began as an online satirical campaign gradually developed into a physical protest movement, particularly around allegations concerning the NEET medical entrance examination. NEET is not an ordinary examination. For millions of Indian students, it represents years of preparation and potentially their entire future. The protesters therefore focused their anger on the government's handling of examination irregularities. One of their central demands became clear: they want Union Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan to resign, and they want stronger accountability for examination leaks and failures in the education system. But the movement soon became much larger than a single minister. It became a question about trust. Can India's young people trust the system that decides their future? Then came July 20th. Thousands of CJP supporters gathered at Delhi's Jantar Mantar for a planned Chalo Sansad march to Parliament. According to NDTV, the crowd numbered at least 20,000. But Delhi police had denied permission for the march and imposed restrictions on large gatherings. Authorities argued that security concerns required the restrictions. The protesters, however, wanted to take their demands directly toward the center of political power, Parliament. And then the confrontation began. Police used tear gas and batons as protesters attempted to move beyond the permitted area. Both protesters and police personnel were injured. NDTV reported that police personnel were among those hurt, while the Indian Express, citing police figures, reported that more than 170 people in total, protesters and security personnel, were injured during the violence. The government's supporters can point to the fact that protesters allegedly attempted to breach barricades and that police also reported damage to public property. But the other side of the story is equally important. Images and videos showed young protesters being pushed back, detained, and subjected to tear gas and lathi charge. And that raises a difficult question. When does maintaining public order become excessive force? The confrontation did not end when the march was stopped. According to the Indian Express, protesters returned to Jantar Mantar the following day, with some people displaying visible injuries. The report also described shortages of food and water at the protest site. Police and paramilitary personnel remained heavily deployed. The authorities said they were dealing with a potentially volatile situation, but protesters saw something different. They saw a government determined to prevent them from taking their message closer to Parliament. And this is where the political debate becomes much bigger than the CJP itself, because democracy does not only mean voting every few years. Democracy also means the ability to criticize those in power, the ability to protest, the ability to demand accountability, and the ability to ask uncomfortable questions. At the same time, democratic protest also has limits. Violence, attacks on police, and destruction of public property cannot simply be ignored. That is why the central issue should not be, are protesters good or bad? The real question is, was the state response proportionate? That is the question India now has to confront. The controversy grew even further as authorities introduced additional restrictions. Reuters reported that authorities shut down 16 metro stations in and around central Delhi during the escalation. The report also said mobile internet services were blocked in parts of the area. These measures affected far more than protesters. They affected commuters, businesses, restaurants, and ordinary residents. Authorities said the restrictions were connected to security concerns, but human rights advocates and critics viewed them as measures designed to restrict the protest movement. And this is where the Modi government faces a serious democratic test, because governments have a legitimate responsibility to protect public safety. But governments also possess enormous power. They control police forces, they can impose restrictions, they can regulate public spaces, and during a political protest, that power must be used carefully. Otherwise, a government can begin treating dissent itself as a security threat. That is why the images of tear gas and batons have become so politically powerful. For supporters of the government, they represent police trying to restore order. For protesters, they represent the state trying to silence them. Two completely different interpretations of the same event. Now, to understand this story properly, we also need to hear the government's position. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has not simply dismissed the examination crisis. According to NDTV, Modi has called for strict punishment for those responsible for paper leaks and described preventing leaks as a national responsibility. The government has also proposed tougher action and special mechanisms to prosecute those responsible. But protesters say that does not answer their central question. Their argument is simple: punishing people after a leak is not enough. They want to know, why are these leaks happening? Who is responsible? Why should students bear the consequences? And most importantly, who accepts political responsibility when an examination system fails? That is why the protesters continue to demand the resignation of Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan. And according to recent reporting, the government has shown no clear willingness to accept that demand. What makes the CJP story particularly interesting is that it is no longer confined to one street in Delhi. Support has appeared in other Indian cities. In Mumbai, police detained protesters during demonstrations linked to the movement, according to the Indian Express. In Pune, thousands reportedly gathered in solidarity, and online the movement has become even more powerful. What began with humor, memes, and satire has transformed into a political language for a generation that feels increasingly frustrated. That is perhaps the most important part of this story. The CJP movement is not just about a cockroach symbol, it is about what the symbol represents. A generation saying, "You may laugh at us, you may ignore us, but you cannot pretend we do not exist." Reuters has described the movement as the most significant youth opposition challenge to Modi's government since he came to power in 2014. And that is a remarkable transformation for a movement that began largely as online satire. Government representatives have met with CJP-linked protesters. The discussions have focused on examination reforms and the protesters' demands. But as of July 25th, the biggest disagreement remains unresolved. The protesters continue to demand political accountability, particularly the education minister's resignation. The government has indicated that resignation is not currently on the table, so the question is, can negotiations prevent the next confrontation, or will the protest movement become even larger? That answer may determine whether this crisis ends at the negotiating table or returns to the streets. And now we come to the question that goes beyond the CJP. This is not only about Narendra Modi, it is not only about Dharmendra Pradhan, and it is not only about examination leaks, it is about the relationship between power and protest in the world's largest democracy. A government has the right and the responsibility to maintain public order. Protesters have the right to demand answers, police have a duty to prevent violence, but police power must also remain proportionate. And governments must understand something very important. A protest does not automatically become anti-national simply because it is uncomfortable. Criticism is not treason. Dissent is not automatically disorder. And asking a government to accept responsibility is not the same as attacking the country. At the same time, protesters must understand that democratic rights come with responsibilities too. Peaceful protest is powerful. Violence weakens the cause. Destruction of public property weakens the cause. Attacking police weakens the cause. The strongest protest is one that can stand firmly on its demands while refusing to become violent. The CJP movement started with humor, but today the joke is no longer the story. The story is about students. It is about examinations. It is about political responsibility. It is about police power. And ultimately, it is about democracy. The question now facing the Modi government is not simply, how do we stop this protest? The bigger question is, how do we restore trust? Because tear gas can disperse a crowd, barricades can stop a march, police can clear a road, but none of those things can answer a student who asks, will my future be decided by my hard work or by a system I cannot trust? And perhaps that is why the CJP protest matters. Not because everyone must agree with it, not because every allegation is automatically true, but because in a democracy, even an uncomfortable question deserves an answer. What do you think? Was the government right to impose restrictions for security, or did the police response go too far? And should Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan accept political responsibility? Tell us your opinion in the comments. If you believe these questions deserve a wider discussion, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who follows Indian politics. This is not just a story about one protest. It is a story about power, accountability, and the right to be heard. Thanks for watching. Please share, like, and follow my side for update news and help to CJP how to left down Modi government.